Well, welcome back, everybody, to this, our final historical panel of the day. If in the first few panels we were looking on many occasions at some quite granular issues like the Island disputes, Vilnius, particular naval engagements and other matters, this panel we're going to adopt a more bird's-eye perspective. It's entitled From Neutrality to Grand Geopolitical Designs, Security Formulas for the Baltic. Now, unfortunately, we've lost one of our panelists, but one advantage of that is that we have a little bit more time, I hope, for discussion, more than perhaps we've had in one or two other panels, and I would really encourage you then to engage and to pose questions. We're very lucky to have two excellent panelists who have turned up. Jörg Hackmann from the University of Szczecin. He is a well-known fixture on in the history of the Baltic Sea region. Many studies to do with history and memory, to do with sociability in the Baltic, the history of the Jews in the Baltic. And he's going to be looking at German conceptions of the Baltic space, the kind of Zwischeneuropa, if I understand you correctly. And then he will be followed by Sławomir Łukasiewicz, who is Professor of European Studies at the University of Lublin, who is an expert on the whole Intermarium concept and the whole question of European integration, Poland's particular role in that regard. They're both going to speak back to back, and then we will move to discussion. Please.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, Charles, for the very friendly invitation to Cambridge. And actually, I have to start, what I usually should not do, explaining a little bit why I'm here and what will you hear from me in the next 15 minutes. So when I received the very friendly invitation to Cambridge, it was without giving a presentation, but in my reply to the invitation, I sent a paper, which actually is not a scholarly paper, something which developed out, let's say, of some kind of a political focus a couple of years ago, and then, so first it was done for a newspaper, but then it turned out in a, let's say, half political, half scholarly paper. And this is then the background of what I'm going to talk. And it's actually not only about the German perception of Zwischeneuropa, but I'm also trying to show the entanglements with other national discourses, in particular the Polish one. So Sławomir then will face a situation that a couple of things I will be talking also at least very briefly about. So why talking about German concepts or about concepts in general of Eastern European space? My starting point was an current one a couple of years ago, so 2015, when the idea of a Three Seas initiative was launched in Poland. In Poland, this is Trójmorze, and so the Polish colleagues probably would immediately associate this with the concept of Międzymorze, which was something from the interwar period we will be talking about. And my background then was that this rise of the idea of Europe in between, or something in between, region between the seas, goes along with the fall of a term which had been very prominent in looking at this part of Europe before, namely East Central Europe. And so it's, let's say, about the fall of East Central Europe and the rise of Europe in between. Very briefly, so looking at the key terms I'm going to talk about. So this is, you see them on the screen. And actually, the first thing we should say is that at the beginning was the concept of Mitteleuropa. So Middle Europa, Central Europe was something which was existing in a German geographical discourse throughout the 19th century and maybe even earlier, but change is nature during World War I. And this is important because with the German expansion towards the east, then let's say only Länderkunde, so description of German space was not enough, so there must have been something more. And the first approaches were rather traditional. So, and actually, so if you, Friedrich Naumann is very often quoted, but this is actually something about, let's say, political union of Germany and so the Habsburg monarchy. So, and not really thinking about geographical space or the definition of geographical space. A little bit different was the case with Joseph Part. Similar spatial background, also focusing, let's say, on something which binds together Germany and Austria-Hungary, but with a more, let's say, already geographical background. And then one thing he then develops is the idea of a triad of high mountains, middle mountains, and the lowlands. And this is specific for Central Europe and those regions which don't have it, they are not part of Central Europe. But he also then developed something of the isthmus between the Baltic and the Black Sea, something which then appears in these ideas of a region between the seas. So let's say this is the starting point. Before the First World War, activated during the First World War was thinking of Middle Europa instead of German space, but things then definitely changed after the war, in particular with the emergence of new states, and this makes then the whole thing much more dynamic than it had been before. There has been an attempt by a scholar of history of geography, Hans-Dietrich Schulz, who tried to develop these many pictures how European space was perceived in German debate, and actually so we'll then focus on the lower right side. So this is then the idea of Zwischeneuropa. But before we do that, let's go one step back and look at the idea of East Central Europe. As I said, this was, let's say, my starting point. This existed actually as a term in geography, as we see on this map. I think it's from 1902 by a Polish geographer who already had the term of East Central Europe. And let's say what you see is rather describing the space of the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth, to make it very briefly. So meaning the idea existed in Poland already before the First World War, but then became much more prominent after the war. In particular, because now this, seen from the German perspective, this idea of a Middle Europa, including many, or some parts east of, let's say, the traditional German space, now were independent states, so it could not really be subsumed only under Middle Europa, but then the idea emerged that these östliches Mitteleuropa, East Central Europe is something special which needs more attention. And this has actually, this debate has two threads. One is a scholarly, epistemological, and the other is a political one. Both are closely connected to Polish scholar, Oskar Halecki, well-known scholar of Polish history in the interwar period and after 1945, in US American exile, and where he wrote his book on the borderlands of Western civilization. And actually this idea of is to develop for the American students, or to show them that there is something historical connected to Europe behind the Iron Curtain. So this is more or less what Halecki did in this book, but this goes back to debates already on the International Historians Congresses in Oslo and Warsaw, so late 20s, early 1930s, where there was a debate about the regions or regionalization in historiography of Europe. And so the main point was to make distinctions in the, let's say, East European space, and Halecki's contribution is to implement the idea of East Central Europe. Actually, he also had then a West Central Europe, which actually was not really used as a term afterwards. But so the point of East Central Europe was clearly going back to these scholarly debates of the 1920s and 1930s. And the political aspect, this goes then already beyond Halecki, was that this idea of East Central Europe, let's say, was rediscovered during socialism, during late socialism in the 1980s. So describing, similar like Halecki did, so the region behind the Iron Curtain, which is different, let's say, from something in general Eastern. So that, let's say, there are more West connections to Western Europe, specific cultural features, and so on. And actually leading to such a point, if you look at Janušić, very interesting book on the three regions of Europe. So where he has East, West, and East Central. So which of course doesn't sound very logical, but explains the specific situation, let's say, of this part of Eastern Europe, which is very much West, let's say, in its structure. So this would be Schitz's argument, and this actually goes back to Halecki and then explains the political dimension behind. There is also a geopolitical aspect in this, namely that this idea of East Central Europe is not geopolitical, so it's against geopolitics. So it's despite Soviet rule over Eastern Europe, there is something which is different. So this is the debate of the 1980s, early 1990s, which somehow goes back to Halecki and explains the relevance of this term of East Central Europe. But so this was East Central Europe, but now about Zwischeneuropa. Zwischeneuropa goes back to the German geographer Albrecht Penck, who was rather, so actually he was not a scholar of geopolitics, so not like Ratzel or others, but rather describing, let's say, morphologies of landscapes and the relation between, let's say, people and landscape. And he then had this idea of describing something between West, which is he calls Vordereuropa, and so rather connected with maritime structures, and then there's a continental East, and there's something in between. And this in between, as you see, is a very broad region, so stretching from Sweden and Finland as far as to Greece. So it's not about, let's say, ethnic structures or something like this. So it's just showing that this is, let's say, neither West nor East. But it's quite clear that he developed this in order to somehow explain why Germany is expanding during the First World War. So it's clearly based on the war experiences. And then in addition, he introduces something which you see on the right side, so a little bit difficult, so it's a reconstruction by Schulz. But what Penck calls the Varangian border zone, Varägische Grenzsaum. And this means this Zwischeneuropa is not homogeneous region, but there is something where, let's say, the features of this cultural, of course, more or less German-dominated culture somehow fades away and has then, let's say, some border zone with Russia. And if you look closely, so this border zone is somewhere on the eastern side of the Baltic provinces or Baltic states. Another similar approach, also to, let's say, have a larger Europe in between, is another German scholar, also like Penck from Vienna. Hugo Hassinger, who then developed, apart from Central Europe, also a Baltic Europe comprising so Sweden, Finland, and the later Baltic states. So let's say this is very much the debate shaped by the First World War. And this actually, there is then a situation going on leading to the term of Randstaaten, so rim states, describing this region between Germany and Russia, Soviet Russia, but excluding usually Poland. So if we have cordons sanitaires, so Poland is clearly a part of it, but in this Randstaaten, so it's more Finland and the 3 Baltic states. And of course, you might assume that this has a negative connotation, so that these states maybe should not be there or are not as capable as the empires are. So this is, let's say, something in between, something which might be only of limited relevance in time and might disappear afterwards. Let's say these are very much so the basic discussions in German. And now I come to brief entanglements, namely that similar debates we see also in the Polish debate. So if we have, let's say, this Zwischeneuropa by Penck, the already, and Halecki comes back with a political concept. So Halecki, a part of this idea of Eastern Europe, also introduced quite early the idea of a Polish-dominated region between the seas, so which then is Międzymorze or Intermarium, or in the Polish debate, also going back to the immediate period after the First World War, and we could even go further. And so if we would look, let's say, on the debate on the access to the sea, which was, as you know, very relevant for Poland. So having a state that has access to the Baltic, this was a relevant debate, and clearly refers, so the Polish debates refer to Ratzel's idea that only those states or those nations that are capable of managing the sea should have access to it. So which then would imply that the Poles do not have it because they are not capable. So there we see clearly entanglements of defining the space in between Germany and Russia, and such entanglements, and this will be already the last major point, then can also be seen the other way around in a very telling German book by the journalist Giselher Wirsing, who as a young man, so actually this was published in 1932, I think he made his PhD in national economics in 1931, and before he was traveling throughout East Central, Northeastern Europe, and actually he was somehow, so from a conservative, so young conservative group, and fascinated of what was going on, and his idea then is in this Zwischen Europa und die deutsche Zukunft to go away from this idea that everything east of Germany is shaped by German culture, but the other way around, so that Germany should look what is going on in these new nations in between, and in particular focus on those governments, parties dealing with peasants. As we know, so these peasant parties had a huge share in politics in the interwar period, so meaning that Germany should look at these new governments and seek contacts to them, and then convince them that in the rivalry between Germany and the Soviet Union, then they should choose the German option. So this is very briefly what Wirsing did. Actually, Wirsing then was an influential journalist during the Third Reich and also after 1945 in Western Germany. And this idea, and there it comes together with the Polish idea of the 2C region or Intermarium. Then, so the title was taken over by a Polish, Austrian, maybe not so much historian, but a journalist who then takes up in the 1950s the term of Zwischeneuropa, but then actually repeats the Polish version. So we see emerging in the titles, so, which clearly show that ideas of the this shaping or discussing this region in between, there are clearly connections, so either strengthening the German influence or the Polish influence, and then rather marginalizing all other smaller ones. Yeah, actually, this is already most of the things I wanted to, yeah, I think I should stop. I wanted to talk about. So, and this then brings me back to my starting point. So the 3Cs initiative. Here you see this nice picture. I think it was in 2017 when Trump visited Warsaw, and then he was directed to this meeting, and I think he did not really know what he was doing there, but it's but why is it relevant? Because this idea of this 3C initiative, if you look at the documents, it's clearly about energy, so geopolitical things, and or maybe rather geo-economic issues, but there is also a geopolitical component in it, namely excluding the West of the European Union and bringing these new states together. And my argument following a Polish political scientist is that this is rather a dangerous thing, because if it's taken serious, so it excludes these states from cooperating with the western part or the older part of the European Union and exposed it to threats from the east. So this was a statement of 2017, but I think things have even become worse meanwhile. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I think we will now pass almost seamlessly to Professor Łukasiewicz's lecture, which is about the main geopolitical concepts of interwar Poland, Intermarium, federalism, and Prometheism. And we've already heard quite a bit about the German side of that story, and now we will hear it from your perspective.
Dear Professor, dear guests, first of all, thank you very much for kindly the invitation to this conference. I should say that after listening to all brilliant speeches, and especially the last one, I'd like to comment on them all. Starting with this 3Cs initiative, which for me is an attempt to revive certain historical concept and put this into completely different conditions we have internationally, because remember that before the Second World War there was not European Union. Now we have European Union, but the concept is taken from the past. Nevertheless, the name was especially different from Intermarium. I will say a few words about Intermarium now, because they wanted to distinguish themselves at least a little bit. Nevertheless, once again, thank you very much for invitation, and I would like to say quite briefly about three concepts which we should treat supplementary. We cannot talk about them separately because I think they were all reactions to a certain geopolitical vacuum which emerged after the First World War in our part of Europe. Of course, we've heard a lot about diplomacy. We've heard a lot about the different concepts, also with Mitteleuropa and other German concepts just recently. I would like to add to this, for example, some concepts of federalization of Austria-Hungary, which was discussed in late 19th, early 20th century. We can show also that there were different concepts how to reorganize the whole territory of Central or Eastern Europe. I will refer to this as well as the name. Remember, first of all, that it was always sphere of influence. After Congress of Vienna, the whole territory was divided into three parts between Prussia, Austria, and later Austria-Hungary and Russia. Yes, all the empires collapsed, and it caused the necessity to build something new instead of the former international order. I will refer to this as well. And what I would like to add before going strictly to Polish concepts, we have to see this from totally different perspectives. Every country had a concept how to reorganize this part of the world. Not only Germany, which was very weak, remember after this, not only Russia, which we had a few Russias, we'll come back to this in a moment, not only France, not only all the other great players, also Great Britain had a concept, and I'm citing here on the slide Professor Sims, who referred to Halford Mackinder, not only because he was a great geographer and invented, or let's say described heartland of earlier pivot area, but simply he advised to British decision makers that it is something important and they cannot lose contact with this part of the world. So everyone was thinking about this region. And what we can find in Polish thought of those times, this is the split between two main concepts. The concept of Piłsudski, which was touched by Donatas a little bit, and concept of Roman Dmowski, who was another great and very important thinker, but nationalist thinker. Piłsudski, to show you what was the main distinction between them, Piłsudski referred to something what we called in Polish tradition the political nation. Political nation meant the earth of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So it referred to different nations or different ethnic groups which lived on the territory of former Polish Republic. With all the differences, of course, we'll discuss to this just in a moment. While Dmowski was fascinated by the concept of national egoism and ethnic nation. So nations which emerged during the 19th centuries and at the beginning of 20th century. And he supported very strongly building of Poland within ethnic frontiers. Yes, no other nations, or at least very, very small number of them within the borders. Why? Because he said it can provoke new problems. Yes, we'll deal with minorities because of League of Nations, because of many other legal issues. So let's keep this project and focus only on Poland for Poles. You can hear this many times everywhere in the world, even today. Piłsudski tried to do something else, and he referred somehow to some old concepts. These are quite contemporary maps dealing with the history. What is important on the first one is to show that Poland, or not exactly Poland, by dynasty of Jagiellons, spread between three seas. So we have no concept, but we had some dynasty reality in the 17th century and in some other moments. Nevertheless, it shows that there was one of the reference. Yes, how to rebuild the whole region in accordance with some historical patterns. The second map is with Poland of the interwar period, where you have also some other states. It is not maybe the perfect map. Of course, there was not Ukraine or Belarus or something. Nevertheless, it was the concept showing that maybe it is possible to revive this area as an intermarium. Intermarium means something between seas, something which spread from Baltic to Adriatic to Black Sea, as geographically. We could say what is the difference between Intermarium or Mitteleuropa or some other concept. It is still about the same region. Yes, it is still almost about the same territory. There were differences because it was prepared by different nations and different politicians with different political aims. Yes, so this is about geopolitics. So geography was treated politically for certain political purposes. And the main thing which Pilsudski discovered very quickly, that Poland, even independent, is between Germany and Russia. Okay, Germany, he said, is quite weak after the First World War, but Russia is really a threat. Yes, and we should be very, very afraid of this new Soviet state. Moreover, thanks to Polish Bolshevik War of 1920, he very quickly was perceived as a defender of Western civilization. I remember such a lecture I had for my students, and there was a French student when I said that Poles treated this as a miracle of Vistula in 1920 when Poles stopped Bolsheviks. Okay, it was maybe in terms of religion quite unacceptable, but from the point of view of defense of Western civilization against this wave of Bolshevism, it was something. And we just discussed this with our colleague, is that probably it forced or it convinced Pilsudski that he's in position simply to demand more in the region. Yes, and he introduced some different concepts. Intermarium was one of the concepts, and Intermarium was strongly connected with federalism. And now federalism, we should treat as this reference to the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Even today, lawyers say that it was a federalist project, not federalist like United States of America today, but federalist, let's say, in its essence of those times. Yes, it went into the direction. So Pilsudski said, okay, we can try to rebuild something similar with Lithuania, maybe with Belarus, and he very quickly discovered that it is not very easy. And thanks to Donatas, you know perfectly why it didn't work. Frankly speaking, I was afraid that after my speech, I will be accused of reviving old ghosts, but thanks to Donatas, he did this for me. Thank you very much. Nevertheless, Pilsudski was very pragmatic, and he said that, okay, if we cannot do this with Lithuanians, he discovered, thanks to the other thinkers, like Leon Wasilewski, who was also the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that there are other nations and other states who can cooperate with Poland, like Latvia or Estonia. And with the help of Estonia and Latvia, he can play, let's say, with Lithuania, and he can play also the issue of Vilnius. He can play, let's say, the whole rearrangement of the borders, because the borders were still the issue just after the First World War. Another thing was the problem of Ukraine. And I'm sorry that we are moving more to the south, but without Ukraine we cannot understand the full range of Pilsudski's politics towards Russia of those times. Yes, so Ukraine was sometimes in this Intermarium project, sometimes was treated separately as an ally. If you remember, the whole Polish Bolshevik War started because Pilsudski went to Kiev together with Petlura, then he went back to Poland, and this is why we had this battle, we had this war. And eventually there was a very strong group of Ukrainians living in Poland before the Second World War who cooperated with Pilsudski, and from the other side, because we had Ukrainians on Polish territory, it caused a lot of problems because it was treated as minority with all the rights and so on and so forth. So from one side there was a very idealistic, we should say, project, referring to another speech we had about idealism and realism. So this idealistic project of rebuilding the former Jagiellonian Jagiellonian union, but from the other side, reality forced Pilsudski and some other politicians to do something not so idealistic. I do not want to defend Pilsudski or Pilsudskiites because, you know, after 1926 it was not full democratic regime. Okay, it is. We can discuss this further. Nevertheless, once again, if we are comparing this with the politics in Europe of those times, it was simply very difficult to find some other solutions if you were a politician. And very quickly emerged another project, the last one I would like to describe for you, which was strictly directed against Soviet Russia. And this project was, first of all, based on cooperation with two group of nations. The first, it was still the group of Baltic nations. Piłsudski never lost this idea to cooperate with Lithuania, because he felt very strongly connected with this country, not only with Vilnius, but simply with the culture. I will not describe this maybe in details. And on some military level, or even intelligence level, there was some cooperation. Yes, there were, let's say, the relations were freezed, and even there were some bad deeds. Yes, Poland forced Lithuania to revive diplomatic relations just before the Second World War. That's okay. Nevertheless, Piłsudski never left the concept. And with Estonians, with Latvians from one side, but from the other side with some Caucasus nations, from Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Piłsudski and his supporters, they tried to create the concept of Prometheism. What is Prometheism? In a few words, it was the concept to dismember Russia along nationality seams. What does it mean? Simply, it was the concept to strengthen nation building or building of nation states for Georgians, for other nations in Caucasus region, and somehow to stabilize situation in the Baltic region, and then to support all the other nations and ethnic groups within Soviet Russia, simply to weaken the whole Soviet Empire. Once again, we can say it is very idealistic how to achieve this. Nevertheless, believe me, I can show you certain line of this thinking even up to our days. Even in American foreign policy, if you want. There is no room for this. Nevertheless, I think it is quite interesting. So the last thing I should say about the interwar period is the concept of Joseph Beck, who tried to build alternative concept, because all the other concepts failed. Prometheism worked mostly on the level of intelligence. So yes, they were able to build some networks, but nothing else. You remember that Soviet Union in the 30s, it was so closed country that it was not possible to support nations inside the empire. And Joseph Beck, another minister of foreign affairs, proposed so-called Third Europe, mostly directed toward southern part of Polish neighborhood. And we can compare this with other projects like Władysław Sikorski during the Second World War, when he started a cooperation with Czechoslovakia of those times. So in certain sense, this Intermarium project focused more on the southern direction and abandoned a little bit the eastern one and the northern one. Yes, so Baltic states disappeared somehow from this picture. There were some attempts. Still, Intermarium project was alive. There were some journals dealing with this. In Polish, of course, it is called Międzymorze. Yes, so you can find the Polish word Międzymorze. It means simply Intermarium. And some federalist projects also were still in progress during the Second World War. But the Second World War caused that all of them failed mostly because of Stalin's opposition against all of them. Of course, Stalin was not in favor of Prometheism, for sure, but was not in favor also to any federal project in this part of Europe, because he saw precisely that it can be the dangerous for expansion of the Soviet Union. And so he opposed to this as well. And to finish with this, I would like to refer to what Jörg said about Oskar Halecki, because Oskar Halecki was a historian who was of mixed origins. He was partially Pole, partially Croat, partially Austrian, and he developed this concept living first of all in Austria-Hungary. Then he moved to Poland and he became a very prominent professor. Then he became the disciple of Ashkenazi, also mentioned here by Donatas. Then he worked for League of Nations. Then he started a certain society of historians from all the other regions. So even if it was not possible to create this as a certain political project, we can say that on the level of soft diplomacy or soft power, Poland started certain process. Yes, because academia, believe me, can do something instead of politics if politicians are not able to start some processes. So probably I should stop here, and I hope we'll have a discussion around some such points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and for leaving us with the intriguing thought that academics may have something to say to politicians. We have, fortunately, a reasonable amount of time for discussion. I'm going to begin with a question of my own and then open up. Both of you in your equally fascinating remarks alluded quite frequently to the way in which the stories you're talking about go all the way into the present day, and there are resonances. So my first question would be for Jörg, which would be that, I mean, there's been to what extent do you see these Zwischeneuropa present in the current German discourses? One of the criticisms that is made of present-day German policy towards Poland and the Baltic states is that it's almost kind of colonial, that it needs to be somehow, the view needs to be decolonized, is the phrase that's occasionally used. So I wondered whether you saw echoes of that story in present-day policy. And equally then for Sławomir, couldn't the same criticism be made of Poland? I mean, obviously I take your point that Pilsudski's vision is not an imperialist one in the classic sense, it's a federalist one, but nevertheless it is one which rubbed up against national self-determination as was understood by those particular nations, and Donata spoke about that, but there are other examples in the region as well. And isn't, in a sense, the Three Seas initiative perhaps going to hit the same buffers, or has a great deal now changed so that those ghosts perhaps are not as present as before? So Jörg, why don't you begin?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think so. The term Zwischeneuropa does not appear in German political debates, but the implications do. In particular, if you compare it once again, or put it in relation to East Central Europe. So let's say the idea of East Central Europe was that there's a close connection between let's say West Central Europe in this sense of Germany, and the responsibility to take care of the new states entering European structures. So exchange not only let's say a material sense, but also of expertise and so on. And when this in particular, so with regard to Poland, changed in 2015 with the peace government, so you had this idea, I think it was Martin Schulz who was telling about the Putinization of Poland, so meaning definitely othering them. So they are not like the, let's say, civilized Western Europeans, so they behave like non-democrats. And this means that you have the idea of othering definitely as an element in a political discourse, partly also being perceived as a problem. So that, so what I perceive, let's say, on the German-Polish borderland is that there's a desperate search for initiatives that are still keeping to German-Polish cooperation and dialogue, because you don't have it on the government level anymore. So, so this means there is obviously, so one sees the necessity to continue the cooperation between Germany and Poland, but it's clear that there must be different ways how this is perceived. So maybe this is the first answer.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I'm not sure if I'm able to answer this properly. Nevertheless, first of all, Piłsudski in certain moments skipped the project because he said, if you want to build a federation, you need a partner. If you don't have partners, you cannot build a federation. So in this sense, what he did, we can see from different perspectives. It can be even imperial perspective because he had to stop, or he had to build Poland within certain borders. If you remember Poland, the Polish borders were accepted precisely 100 years ago. In 1923, yes, so by the Council of Ambassadors, and it was not a very easy process if you are taking into account that it took 5 years to establish, let's say, the border. So in this sense, I would like to emphasize that Piłsudski in those moments was more pragmatic than idealistic. I cannot say he was realist. It is something else in Polish tradition, but it is for another discussion. And then some Polish thinkers developed what does it mean that you have partnership, that you have partners. And for example, I can cite Adolf Bocheński, a person who wrote a book Między Niemcami a Rosją, between Germany and Russia. The book, very important book for Polish thinking, where he explained that Poland cannot be imperialistic even in thinking. Yes, that we should respect all the other nations, hers of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So I'm very happy that I think we all know that we are studying history, not to repeat some mistakes. And precisely this Bocheński tried to explain. If we are dealing with history, if we are dealing with what happened just after the First World War, we can do both. Yes, we can make the old mistakes, or we can build something new. And this concept of partnership was totally new, I think. He wrote a very important article during the Second World War about federation based on the partnership. And unfortunately, he died during the war. He was killed during the Battle of Ancona. And there was some certain continuation of this type of thinking within milieu of Kultura, Parisian Kultura, and Jerzy Giedroyć, Juliusz Mieroszewski. But they skipped, I should say, they abandoned this concept of federalism, because they cited Giedroyć very, very often, that if you want federation, you need a partner. And they were trying to look for something else. So they built a concept of ULB, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus, which was totally different, based rather on this assumption explained by Bocheński. And they developed this until the early 90s, where you have the new government of Poland. And this government, with some mistakes, I should say, I will not discuss maybe diplomacy in this moment, you know, all the thugs, I think. Nevertheless, this government was, I think, committed, or this government committed quite good things in regard to our Eastern neighborhood, which emerged after the collapse of communism. And now, if you are asking about how the concepts live in current debate, so I started with this 3Cs initiative to show that they changed the name. As you said, they focused on economy, showing that this cooperation is important. But what I could add to this is that Trump was not accidentally on this picture. Yes, it was the concept which they sold to America, first of all. From the other side, they tried to sell the concept to China. When America started let's say, rivalry with China because of economy, they decided, okay, to keep this only toward this American, to keep only this American dimension. Nevertheless, now there is no place for such a concept. So, how to say, structurally and organizationally, we still have 3Cs University. We have some initiatives in this area, but everyone is aware what you said, that this is the concept which can cause that Poland is outside European Union together with some other countries which can join us. This is not favorable for all of us because of security reasons.
Thank you. So, questions? Yes. No, go ahead.
Thank you very much. This was an extremely interesting panel, and in particular because the papers were really so closely related. And I have a question to both of you, actually a different one, but in some sense related. So first of all, to Jörg, I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about the organizational principle within the construct of Mitteleuropa, because there were like varying theories as to how this type of region would be constructed and what types of relationships between the constitutive entities, like for example federalism, could be organizing it. And to Sławomir, my question is pretty much related to what Brendan was asking about, and still the national self-determination question. So I was wondering whether this idea of partnership that you, for example, brought up and commented on, was also interpreted or reinterpreted in some sense as a form of self-determination. Because before 1917, self-determination was very often related to ideas of federalism, whereas Bolsheviks were quite successful in severing the relationship between self-determination and federalism. So I was wondering whether in Poland actually something has made an attempt to reclaim the principle and give it a new version of an old meaning.
Because we're running out, I'll gather a couple more questions, if that's all right. James.
I think I'll just shout.
Yeah.
I know two elements here. You alluded indirectly to the Chinese 16 plus 1, 17 plus 1. And in a sense, the 3 Cs is an American response to that. And when you talk to Kalinda Grabar-Kitarovich or Andrzej Duda, they will say, yes, it was a domestic originated idea, but clearly it is supported by the United States. So there is an external view of this region in the context of 3 Cs, of 16 plus 1, of Intermarium. But it occurs to me, particularly as we have 2 Polish-based academics here, that what we're looking at here in the Intermarium is the result of the fact that the Second Republic was a hybrid state. That you have on the one hand the endecia, the ethno-nationalism of Roman Dmowski, and you have on the other hand the romantic, multinational element of the Jagiellon view of Piłsudski, of course, a Vilnius native himself. So it seems to me that there is a Polish-led definition of this region, and there is an external definition of the same region, and they have different roots. One primarily economic and inward-looking, and one from the root in Poland.
We'll take one more very quick question. Yes. Nice.
Just briefly for both speakers, for both concepts, Intermarium and this Zischen Europa, why is there an interest in bringing the Balkans into it in both maps? I mean, I can understand bringing the Baltics, but the Balkans with all their issues, ethnic differences, political instability, why is there a desire to bring that part of Europe into this larger concept? Thank you.
Thank you. So you have about a minute and a half each.
Okay, so very briefly. If on the organizing principles, so actually I was rather looking on the, let's say, geographical concepts, and then it's more, let's say, describing this region being somehow coherent, and this is rather by cultural features or whatsoever. And actually, let's say, okay, so I think we might look differently at Naumann, but so if we have, let's say, Penck and all his successors, so it's more of providing arguments why this region somehow should be connected to Germany, and this was not thinking about political structure, so it was more thinking that the culture is somehow similar or influenced by the Germans, so that the Germans are the influential groups and so on. So this was my main argument, but of course one could look a little bit closer in it. Very briefly on the expansion. So what I did not do, of course I could have done this, so looking a little bit more on the place of the Baltic Sea region, but as you see, the definition of what the geographers were thinking about was rather in the big picture, starting somewhere in Finland and going as far as Greece, and this was quite a common thing. So, and I think that it is a problem of Balkans versus Baltics is rather, I think, more modern thing, so that we think so we should, the Balkans are more focused on because they are violent and the Baltic region is not that violent, so therefore it's somehow boring. Maybe this is a reason, but so the discourse of the interwar period is definitely unit. So maybe if I may very briefly on the American initiative and the Polish roots. So there is clearly a connection, and if you have, let's say, liquid gas, which now is also very famous in Germany, but of course Poles were much quicker in getting it to Świnoujście. So there is clearly a connection. But I think so at least the Polish contribution is very much, let's say, this anti-Brussels element, and this is where, at least from my perspective, things are turning complicated.
Sławomir, 90 seconds.
I will try to answer both questions at once. First of all, maybe we should imagine that Piłsudski was a socialist. He belonged to Polish Socialist Party, and in this sense we have to think about his imaginations, which were framed by socialism, but socialism dealing with independence of Poland and with this picture of old Respublika, which you saw on the map. Yes, so you know, in the literature you can find very easily that he was surprised in a certain moment that Estonia or Latvia was connected with former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Yes, for him it ended with Lithuania only. Yes, so yeah, you know, it is imagination of politicians. These are totally different things. So if we are talking about Limanowski, if we are talking about Wasilewski, they had totally different background, intellectual background. They thought about the region in different terms. So this is the same with self-determination. Of course, it was used very strongly by Bolsheviks, but it was the rule which was introduced by Wilson and League of Nations, and it was very supportive for Polish independence claims. So there was not contradiction in this sense, but Polish one was socialist of Piłsudski or national of Dmowski, while let's say Bolsheviks wanted to see us as the next republic. And this is why we had the war with Bolsheviks. And the last thing is simply that, of course, I focused on Polish perspective. Forgive me for this. And this is always the mistake we commit, that we have our language, we have our imaginations, and we have to confront them also with Chinese, with American, with all the others, to see that the world is a little bit bigger than our own yard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it's been a really excellent panel, 2 brilliant presentations, terrific discussion. I know there are further questions. We don't have time. I must now yield the floor to Charles Clark, who's going to chair the discussion on contemporary challenges to the Baltics, but not before thanking our 2 presenters.